Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about three different groups in the Revolutionary War and how they were impacted during and at the end of the war. We will decide whether it was revolutionary or not. We are going to look into Indigenous people, women, loyalists, and how revolutionary was the Revolutionary War, and what does revolutionary actually mean based on personal research. We're going to conclude and then we're going to have credits. Before we start, let's set a little bit of context as to why the war happened and how it ended. The war opposed the Patriots and Great Britain. It all started when the Patriots decided that the policies that the British Kingdom was enforcing were unfair, since they were not represented in Parliament, and they declared independence. In 1783, the French and American alliance won the war, gaining independence from Great Britain and leaving a lasting impact on various social groups. The first group, Indigenous people, they were pillars of the war, but did the war have a positive impact on them? The war had a negative impact on indigenous people. The indigenous people fought in the war and it cost them their land, ancestral culture, and way of life, and a part of their identity. During the war, both the British and American colonists made promises. Allying with Great Britain felt safer than allying with American colonists. The first reason was their history. The Powhatan Wars, or French and Indian Wars, for example, the second reason was that King George had agreed to provide more freedom, sovereignty, and land to the Native Americans. In the end, no matter which side they chose, they ended up being let down by both parties. The first piece of evidence is the excerpt of Lord Dermer's proclamation to indentured African American slaves and indigenous people. In this excerpt, Dunmore is declaring that whoever decides to side with the British troops would be freed after the war. This excerpt shows how the British were especially trying to get more troops to win the war. They made promises to the indigenous people that they did not end up fulfilling. The layout of the proclamation expresses sentiments of emergency in the usage of words like "for the more speedily" or "as soon as maybe." This vocabulary choice proves the weakness of the promises made by the British government to free the silenced voices of the American Revolution, considering the circumstances. The second group we're going to talk about today is women. What were their contributions in the war and how were they rewarded? The war had both a positive and negative impact on women. During the war, women held important roles such as nurses, educators, and seamstresses. They tended to the injured, assured children's education amongst turmoil and war, and mended or confectioned the soldiers' clothes. Some of them even infiltrated the battlefield to fight for independence. After the war, they had hope that their pre-war status would be revoked. Before the war, no woman was allowed in local congresses and parliaments. They were submitted to laws they didn't have a say in. Women couldn't vote or work or even own property after being married. A war that seemed so revolutionary would perhaps also be revolutionary to them. Well, it was, in some way. After the war, women were now considered important to the Republic. They could access more education and involve themselves publicly. They even started to be defended by advocates like Abigail Adams. Aside from that, they still couldn't vote, access professions like lawyers or doctors, or even have a role in government. In March 31, 1776, letter to John Adams, Abigail Adams urges him to remember the ladies when forming the new government, warning that men will become tyrants if women are ignored. She hints at the possibility of a female-led rebellion, highlighting the lack of rights and political freedom women faced. Written during the Revolutionary War, the letter shows that women's demands for inclusion and equality persisted beyond the war, suggesting the conflict had a lasting positive impact on their political awareness and activism. Our third group is loyalists. What was the cost of their loyalty to Great Britain? The war had a negative impact on loyalists. After the war, loyalists were considered traitors for fighting alongside the British militias and acting as spies to gather crucial information for the British forces. They showed their loyalty to Great Britain by supporting policies such as tax implementation, opposing protests and boycotts, or even trying to maintain peace and avoid the war, but to no avail. When the outcome of the war fell, loyalists were faced with the loss of their property, the obligation to flee to nations like Canada or Britain, and they equally faced social ostracism, violence, and persecution from patriots. On the other hand, Great Britain ended up compensating those who had suffered losses with riches and land. Our main piece of evidence will be a letter from a loyalist circa 1778. In this testimony of a loyalist, he speaks about all the sufferings he and other loyalists have been through because of their submission to the crown. He talks about how he and how he and his family had to flee to Canada because of everything they went through in the United States. He also mentions how the revolution has brought freedom to some people and ruined others. This piece of evidence supports the claim that the Revolutionary War negatively impacted the Loyalists because it comes from a direct perspective of the issue. Based on our synopsis of the three groups, how revolutionary was the American Revolutionary War? The American Revolutionary War was remarkably revolutionary on the economic and political scale, but less so from a social perspective. It affected indigenous people, women, and loyalists negatively. The first piece of evidence is a letter from a loyalist which talks about the treatment that the loyalists were subjected to after the war. The main focus is the last sentence that says, "The revolution has brought freedom for some, but for us it has meant ruin." The meaning of that sentence could be interpreted as broader. It might not only be focused on the loyalists themselves, but also other groups that were negatively impacted by the war, such as women, indigenous people, and enslaved African Americans. The evidence supports my claim because it shows how the revolution has brought political and economic freedom to social groups like white land owning patriots and led to the social ruin of groups like the indigenous people, the enslaved, or women. The second piece of evidence is Lord Dunmore's proclamation, in which Dunmore is declaring that any individual, whether indentured servants, slaves, or indigenous people, and capable of fighting in a war would join the British troops, will be granted freedom. At first sight, the proclamation seems very promising to the cited groups. Indigenous people at the time were being torn between the two opposing powers, and since the war threatened their safety and their land was becoming a battlefield, they had to choose a side. Even if they decided to stay neutral, they had to fight on their own, which was not ideal. This shows how strained a position the non-land owning and not white and not patriot communities were in, how careful they had to be with their choices, and how the British forces took advantage of the situation to get more troops. This evidence supports my claim because it illustrates the difficulty some social groups faced during the war and how it led to a negative social impact. Lord Dunmore's proclamation offered freedom to enslaved people, indentured servants, and indigenous individuals who joined the British Army, appearing at first to promise liberation. However, it also reveals how vulnerable these groups were during the Revolutionary War. Indigenous communities, caught between two powers and with their land at risk, faced pressure to take sides or defend themselves alone. The proclamation demonstrates how the British exploited these marginalized groups' desperate situations to bolster their forces. This supports the claim that the war had a negative social impact on many non-land owning, non-white, and non-patriot communities who were forced to make difficult and dangerous choices. A few limitations to my claim include the lack of generalizability. Not all social groups were equally affected by the Revolutionary War. Patriots, wild landowners, and soldiers often had different, more favorable experiences. It's also inaccurate to say the war revolutionized economic and political life for everyone. Many marginalized groups, like indigenous people and enslaved African Americans, continued to face hardship, division, and oppression even after the war. What does revolutionary really mean? A true revolution must bring lasting change to the whole community. When social disparity exists, as in the American Revolution, not all benefit equally. If only one dominant group, like land-owning patriots, gains, the revolution isn't complete for all. In diverse societies, each group faces unique struggles, so one movement rarely creates universal change. Conclusion: a brief summary of the document. The American Revolution was not a very revolutionary event in history, based on a personal perspective and definition of revolutionary. It might have changed the predispositions of white patriot land-owning men, but it did not positively impact other social groups.